I never thought I would be the kind of woman telling her story to strangers just to make sense of it, but life has a way of humbling you when you least expect it. My name is Lorraine Whitaker. I'm 67 years old, a widow of 9 years, and until recently, I believed that the hardest chapter of my life had already been written. I had survived losing my husband, Thomas. I had survived learning how to sleep alone in a bed built for two. I had survived watching my only son, Daniel, move out and start a life that didn't need me the way it once did. I thought I understood loneliness. What I didn't understand was how betrayal could walk through your own front door wearing the face of family. 2 months ago, I finally took my first real vacation since Thomas passed. My church group had been planning a trip to Charleston for years, and every time they asked me to go, I found an excuse. The house needed repainting, the garden needed tending. Daniel might stop by. But the truth was simpler. I was afraid to leave the house empty. That house had been ours for 42 years. Thomas and I bought it when Daniel was still in diapers. We chose the pale yellow siding together. We argued about the shutters. We planted the maple tree out front the day Daniel took his first steps. Every scuff on the hardwood floors told a story. Every nail in the wall held a memory. Leaving it felt like leaving Thomas behind. But my pastor said something that stuck with me. He said, "Lorraine, memories don't disappear just because you step outside." So I packed my suitcase, I watered the plants, locked the doors, and gave Daniel a spare key in case of emergencies. He had one already, of course. He and his wife, Melissa, lived 15 minutes away. Melissa and I had never been close, but we were polite. She was modern, ambitious, always talking about open concepts and clean lines and how clutter holds energy. I suppose I represented everything she thought was outdated. Floral curtains, antique china, framed photographs in every hallway. But she never said anything outright, at least not to my face. When I left for Charleston, I felt lighter than I had in years. I walked along the waterfront. I ate shrimp and grits. I laughed with women who remembered me from Sunday school decades ago. For the first time in a long while, I felt like Lorraine again, not just Daniel's mother or Thomas's widow. I called Daniel twice while I was away. He sounded distracted, but fine. He said he and Melissa were busy with some projects. I didn't think much of it. Young couples are always busy. The morning I returned home, my taxi turned onto Maple Drive, and my stomach fluttered with that familiar warmth. There it was, my house, my porch swing still hanging, my rose bushes in bloom. But as we pulled into the driveway, I noticed a large construction dumpster parked along the curb. My first thought was that one of the neighbors must be renovating. I paid the driver, rolled my suitcase up the walkway, and that's when I saw the front door. It was open, not wide, but ajar, just enough to make my heart skip. I distinctly remembered locking it. I stepped inside and froze. The air smelled like paint, sharp and chemical. The familiar beige walls of my living room were gone, replaced by a cold shade of gray. My floral curtains had disappeared. My oak coffee table was nowhere in sight. Plastic sheets covered the floors. And in the middle of it all stood Melissa, holding a clipboard. She looked at me as if she had been expecting a delivery, not the homeowner. "Oh, good," she said, smiling brightly. "You're back early." Early? I had given her my exact return date. My suitcase slipped from the hand and thudded against the floor. What is going on? My voice didn't sound like mine. It sounded thin. Melissa gestured around like a game show host revealing a prize. "We decided to surprise you. The place needed updating. Daniel and I talked about it for months." I felt something crack inside my chest. "You decided?" I repeated. She continued, unfazed. "The walls were dark. The kitchen cabinets were outdated. And honestly, Lorraine, the house felt heavy. We're opening up the space, making it brighter, healthier." Healthier. I walked toward the kitchen in a daze. My cabinets were gone. The cherry wood Thomas had polished every spring was ripped out, stacked in pieces near the back door. The wallpaper I chose when Daniel was 10 had been stripped away. My hands began to tremble. "Where is Daniel?" I asked. "He's at work," she replied casually. "He said you might be emotional, but once you see the finished product, you'll thank us." Emotional. I bent down and picked up a fragment of wood from the pile. I recognized the grain instantly. Thomas had installed those cabinets himself. Every hinge measured twice, every screw placed with patience. I could still see him in that kitchen, humming off key while I handed him tools. Melissa's voice floated behind me. We're thinking quartz countertops, something sleek. And we'll remove that old china cabinet. It closes off the room. I turned to her slowly. That china cabinet was my mother's. She blinked as if that detail were inconvenient. It's in storage for now. For now, the words echoed in my head. I walked back into the living room. The family photos that once lined the hallway were gone. The indentations where frames had hung were visible like ghosts. Did you ask me? I whispered. She hesitated just slightly. We knew you'd resist. Sometimes people need change they don't realize they need. In that moment, something inside me shifted. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet and steady, like a door closing. I realized that this wasn't about paint colors or cabinets. It was about erasure. Melissa didn't see a home filled with history. She saw an outdated property waiting to be modernized. And Daniel, my Daniel, had let her. I picked up my phone with shaking hands and dialed his number. He answered on the third ring. Hey, Mom, you made it back. I swallowed hard. Daniel, I said carefully, why is your wife remodeling my house without my permission? There was silence, then a sigh. Mom, we talked about this. You just don't remember. I felt the ground tilt beneath me. No, I said, my voice steady now. We did not talk about this, and I remember everything.
Daniel's sigh on the other end of the phone cut deeper than any shouted argument ever could. It wasn't anger. It was impatience, the kind you use when you think someone is being unreasonable. Mom, he said slowly, as if explaining something to a child, we brought it up last month. At dinner, Melissa mentioned refreshing the place. You nodded. I could picture that dinner. Roast chicken, overcooked green beans, Melissa talking about her co-worker's open-concept condo. I had nodded because I was listening, not because I was giving permission to dismantle my life. Nodding is not consent, Daniel, I replied quietly. You did not ask me if you could tear out my kitchen. There was a pause, and then he said the words that lodged themselves in my chest. It's not just your house, Mom. It's going to be ours one day. The world seemed to narrow to a single painful point. One day, I repeated, but I am still alive. Melissa shifted her weight near the doorway, pretending not to listen, but hearing every word. Daniel's voice hardened. We're investing in the future. You can't expect us to maintain something outdated forever. I looked around at the plastic sheets, the stripped walls, the empty spaces where my furniture had been. Outdated. That was the word she used, too, as if memories expired, as if love went out of style. Daniel, I said carefully, each syllable measured, you had no right. He exhaled sharply. Mom, you're overreacting. We're paying for everything. It's a gift. A gift. I thought about the cherry wood cabinet splintered in a pile, about the china cabinet wrapped in plastic somewhere I hadn't approved, about Thomas on a ladder with a hammer in his hand. You don't give someone a gift by breaking into their house, I said. You asked for the spare key in case of emergencies. This is not an emergency. He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was clipped. We're already halfway through. Contractors are booked. Deposits are paid. Let's just finish it. You'll see, it'll increase the value. Increase the value? That was the language of transactions, not family. I ended the call before my voice betrayed the storm building inside me. I turned to Melissa. She had set her clipboard down and was watching me with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. Daniel just wants what's best, she said gently, and frankly, Lorraine, this house was stuck. I walked toward her slowly. Stuck in what? She hesitated. In the past. I felt a strange calm wash over me. Not forgiveness, not acceptance, just clarity. The past is where my husband lives, I said. The past is where my son learned to walk. The past is where I held my mother's hand before she died. If that makes this house stuck, then perhaps I am too. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. For the first time, she looked uncertain. A man in a tool belt entered from the hallway. "We're ready to start demo on the living room wall," he said casually, glancing between us. Demo, as in demolish? "No," I said firmly. He looked at Melissa. She cleared her throat. "Just give us a minute." He retreated. I walked to the center of the living room and looked at the wall he had been referring to. It separated the living room from what used to be Thomas's study. His desk was still in there, though I noticed it had been pushed against the wall, papers stacked haphazardly. The thought of that wall coming down made my chest tighten. "You are not removing that wall," I said. Melissa's jaw set. "It opens up the space." "It holds up the house," I replied quietly, "and it holds up my memories." She let out a small laugh, the kind that tries to dismiss emotion as drama. "Lorraine, walls don't hold memories." I looked at her steadily. "No, but the rooms they create do." She folded her arms. "Daniel and I have already made the decisions." And there it was, the truth. I wasn't part of the decision-making process in my own home. I was the obstacle to be managed. I took a deep breath. "Call the contractors off," I said. "Now." Her eyes widened. "We'll lose money." "That is not my responsibility," I replied. She shook her head. "You're being unreasonable." I felt something rise in me then. Not anger exactly, something older, stronger, the same force that carried me through hospital corridors the night Thomas died, the same strength that helped me learn how to pay bills he used to handle. "This house is in my name," I said evenly. "The deed, the mortgage, the insurance, all of it. If one more hammer swings without my permission, I will call the police." The words hung heavy in the air. Melissa stared at me as if seeing me for the first time. Perhaps she had mistaken my softness for weakness, my silence for surrender. She picked up her phone with stiff movements and stepped outside. I heard her speaking urgently, too low to make out the words. I walked into Thomas's study and closed the door behind me. The room smelled like dust and faint cologne. His desk lamp was still there, the leather chair worn where he used to sit. I ran my hand over the surface of the desk, tracing invisible lines. "I'm sorry," I whispered. I felt foolish apologizing to a man who had been gone nearly a decade, but in that moment I felt like I had failed to protect what we built. A knock came at the door. Daniel's voice. "Mom?" I came as soon as Melissa called. My heart twisted at the sound of him. He still sounded like my little boy when he was worried. I opened the door. He looked flustered, tie loosened, hair slightly out of place. He glanced around the study. "You're really going to stop the renovation?" he asked. I studied his face. The same brown eyes as Thomas, the same stubborn crease between his brows. "Yes," I said simply. He ran his hand through his hair. "Mom, we were trying to help." "Help whom?" I asked gently. He hesitated. "All of us." I stepped closer. "Daniel, when you walked down the aisle at your wedding, I stepped back. When you bought your house, I didn't question your choices. I respected that it was yours. Why couldn't you respect that this is mine?" His expression softened for a flicker of a second, then hardened again. "Because you're alone here. We thought maybe if it felt more like us, we'd spend more time." The words hit differently, more like confession than accusation. "So this wasn't about value, it was about ownership." He looked away. I felt a crack form in my certainty. Had I misjudged some part of this, or was this simply another layer of the same wound? I reached for his hand. He let me hold it. "If you want to spend time with me, come sit on my outdated couch, eat at my old table, love me in the house your father and I built. Don't try to replace it with something that looks like a magazine." His eyes filled just slightly, but before he could answer, Melissa's voice called from the hallway. The contractor needs a decision. Daniel squeezed my hand once, then let go. And in that small release, I realized this wasn't just about walls or cabinets. It was about whether my son still saw me as the heart of this home or just a temporary tenant in the way of his future. Daniel stepped out of the study, leaving me alone with the echo of Melissa's voice drifting down the hallway. I could hear the low rumble of the contractor's reply, the shuffle of boots against my hardwood floors, floors that Thomas and I had refinished by hand one summer when money was tight and Daniel was still young enough to sit cross-legged in the corner eating popsicles while we worked. I stood there for a moment longer, steadying myself, then followed my son into the living room. The contractor looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. He wasn't the villain in this story. He was a man hired to do a job. Melissa stood beside him, arms crossed, her face tight with frustration. Daniel stood between us, like a fragile bridge. "Well?" she asked him, not me. Daniel looked at me, then at the contractor. "We're pausing the project," he said finally, "for now." The contractor nodded quickly, as if relieved. "We'll secure everything and clear out for the day. You can call the office when you've made a final decision." A final decision, as if my life were a committee vote. They began gathering tools. The sound of drills being packed away felt like a temporary ceasefire. Melissa turned to Daniel the moment the contractor stepped outside. "This is going to cost us," she said in a sharp whisper that wasn't nearly as quiet as she thought. "Non-refundable deposits, materials already ordered." Daniel rubbed his temples. "I know." I stepped forward. "You made financial decisions about my property without consulting me. If there are consequences, they belong to you." Melissa's eyes flashed. "We were trying to invest in your future, in Daniel's inheritance." There it was again, inheritance, as if I were already a framed photograph on the mantel. "I am not an estate plan," I said quietly. "I am a person." Silence settled over the room, thick and heavy. The house felt wounded, like it had been caught in the middle of a family argument and didn't understand why. Daniel looked around at the stripped walls, the exposed beams where cabinets had been removed. "Mom," he said softly, "it does look dated." I followed his gaze. The paint was gone in patches. The space looked vulnerable. But even in its half-dismantled state, I saw beauty. I saw Christmas mornings. I saw birthday cakes. I saw Thomas standing at the stove flipping pancakes while Daniel giggled from the table. "Dated is not the same as worthless," I replied. Melissa let out a slow breath. "No one said it was worthless." "You implied it," I said, meeting her eyes. "You said it was heavy, unhealthy, stuck." She hesitated, then lifted her chin. "It feels like a museum." The word struck me harder than I expected. A museum. Cold, untouched, preserved for observation, not living. "Do you know why it feels that way to you?" I asked. She didn't answer. "Because you never lived here," I said gently. "You see objects. I see moments." Daniel shifted uncomfortably. "Mom, Melissa didn't mean." "Yes, she did," I interrupted, not unkindly. "And that's all right. We all speak from our own experiences." Melissa's expression softened just slightly. "Lorraine, when I walk in here, I feel like I'm stepping into someone else's past. There's no room for us." Her honesty caught me off guard. For the first time, she wasn't speaking in design jargon. She was speaking as a woman who felt excluded. "There was always room for you," I said quietly. "But room doesn't mean replacing what came before." Daniel looked between us, torn. "We just wanted to make it more inviting. Maybe if it felt updated, you'd let us help more. maybe you'd consider moving in with us someday." I blinked. "Moving in with you?" He nodded. "We worry about you being alone." Ah, there it was. Not just control, not just modernization, fear. "I am alone," I said softly, "but I am not helpless." Melissa stepped closer, her voice less defensive now. "When my grandmother refused to update her house, she fell. There were hazards everywhere. She wouldn't accept help. I guess I projected that." The tension in the room shifted, not gone, but altered. I studied her face, really studied it. I saw exhaustion, anxiety, maybe even genuine concern buried beneath ambition. "You could have talked to me." She nodded slowly. "We tried, but you always change the subject when we mention the future." Because the future without Thomas still frightened me, but that wasn't something I had ever admitted aloud. Daniel stepped forward. "Mom, I'm sorry we didn't ask clearly. I thought you'd resist, and I didn't want another argument." "So you decided for me?" He lowered his eyes. "Yes." The honesty, painful as it was, felt better than the justifications. I walked to the kitchen doorway and looked at the empty space where the cabinets once stood. "Those cabinets were built by your father. Every time I open them, I see his hands." Daniel's shoulder sagged. "I didn't think about that." "No," I agreed. "You didn't." Melissa glanced toward the pile of wood near the back door. "They're not destroyed. They can be reinstalled." Hope flickered faintly in my chest. "Are they intact?" She nodded. "Mostly." The contractor was careful. I turned to Daniel. "If they can be put back, they will be." He hesitated, then nodded. "Okay." The simplicity of that word felt monumental. We stood there, 3 adults in a half-demolished kitchen, trying to find our feeding. "I don't want to erase your memories," Melissa said quietly. I want to feel like we belong here too." I considered her words carefully. Belonging isn't something you create with paint. It's something you build with presence. "You belong because you're married to my son, not because you change my walls." Her eyes glistened just barely. I guess I didn't know how to bridge that gap. Daniel reached for her hand. Neither did I. I exhaled slowly. "Then perhaps we start by acknowledging something important." They both looked at me. "This house is mine," I said calmly. "While I am alive, decisions about it are mine. But that doesn't mean I won't listen. It just means you must respect me enough to ask." Daniel nodded immediately. Melissa followed a second later. "And," I continued, surprising even myself, "perhaps there are small updates we can discuss. Safety improvements, lighting, things that don't dismantle the soul of the place." Melissa's lips parted slightly. "You'd consider that?" "I would consider conversation," I corrected gently. The contractor re-entered briefly to confirm they were leaving for the day. The house fell quiet after the trucks pulled away. The silence felt different now, less invaded, more contemplative. Daniel wrapped his arms around me suddenly, like he used to when he was a boy afraid of thunderstorms. "I'm sorry, Mom," he whispered. I closed my eyes and held him. "So am I." Melissa stood awkwardly nearby. After a moment, she stepped forward too. Her hug was tentative but real. The 3 of us stood there amid plastic sheets and exposed beams, not fully healed, not fully united, but no longer at war. And as I looked around at my wounded kitchen, I realized something surprising. The house had been shaken, but it was still standing, just like us. That evening, after Daniel and Melissa left, I sat alone in the quiet shell of my kitchen and listened to the house breathe. The plastic sheeting rustled faintly with the movement of air through the vents. The late afternoon sun slanted through the windows, catching the dust particles still floating from the day's disruption. For the first time since walking through that open front door, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of what had happened. It wasn't just about cabinets. It was about being slowly moved aside in my own life. When Thomas died, people had patted my hand and told me I was strong, and I was. I learned how to file taxes alone. I learned how to fix a leaking faucet. I learned how to sit at the head of the table without breaking down. But somewhere along the way, I had also become careful not to be a burden, careful not to interfere in Daniel's marriage, careful not to seem old-fashioned or difficult, and in my carefulness, perhaps I had become invisible. I rose from the chair and walked into Thomas's study again. The wall Melissa had wanted to demolish stood firm between the rooms. I placed my palm flat against it, solid, dependable, supportive. That wall had held shelves of Daniel's school trophies once. It had muffled arguments and contained laughter. It had allowed two separate spaces to exist without collapsing into one another. Maybe that was what we needed as a family, not an open concept, but healthy walls. The next morning, I called the contractor myself. My voice was steady when I introduced myself as the homeowner. I asked detailed questions about what had already been removed, what could be restored, and what had been damaged beyond repair. He answered respectfully, perhaps sensing that the situation had shifted. The cabinets can be reinstalled, he confirmed. There may be minor refinishing needed. And the wallpaper? That was stripped completely. I closed my eyes briefly. The wallpaper had tiny blue flowers. I had chosen it the year Daniel started middle school, thinking the kitchen needed something cheerful. Losing it felt like losing a small, ordinary piece of history. "That's all right," I said finally. "We can repaint." There was a pause on the other end. "Ma'am," he said gently, "if I may, sometimes a project like this uncovers things that were aging beneath the surface. There's some wiring behind the cabinets that should be updated. It's a safety concern." Safety, not style, not trend, safety. "I appreciate you telling me," I replied. After hanging up, I made tea and sat at the kitchen table, what was left of it pushed against the wall. I thought about Melissa's grandmother, about Daniel's worry of me being alone. I thought about my own stubbornness. Thomas had always been practical. "Sentiment doesn't mean stagnation," he used to say when I resisted change. He modernized our appliances when needed. He fixed structural issues before they became disasters. He respected the past but prepared for the future. Maybe I had clung so tightly to preserving everything exactly as it was that I hadn't allowed room for necessary evolution. Later that afternoon, Daniel called. "Mom," he said carefully, "Melissa feels awful." "I'm sure she does. So do I." There was a pause. "Can we come by tonight, talk properly?" "Yes," I said, "but this time we sit at the table and we listen." When they arrived, the air between us felt fragile but no longer hostile. Melissa carried a container of soup. Daniel brought fresh bread. Small gestures, but meaningful. We sat in the partially dismantled kitchen, bowls balanced carefully, the room smelling faintly of paint and chicken broth. "I've been thinking," Daniel began. "I handled this badly." Melissa nodded. We both did. I waited. "I think," she continued, choosing her words carefully, "I panicked. Watching you live here alone, I imagined worst-case scenarios, and instead of talking through that fear, I tried to control it." Her vulnerability caught me off guard. "I didn't want to control you," she added quickly. "I just wanted to fix something." "Not everything broken needs fixing by force," I said softly. Daniel reached across the table. "We don't want to push you out, Mom. We don't want to lose you, too." "Too." The word hung there between us. "You lost your father," I said quietly. He nodded, eyes shining. "And you're afraid of losing me." "Yes." It wasn't about real estate. It was about grief that had never fully healed. "I'm not planning on going anywhere," I said with a small smile. "But even if I were, tearing down walls wouldn't stop that." Melissa let out a shaky breath. "I'm sorry I treated your home like a project instead of a sanctuary." The sincerity in her voice softened something in me that I hadn't realized was still rigid. "Thank you," I said simply. We talked for hours that night, not about paint colors or quartz countertops, but about boundaries, about fear, about independence and aging, and the uncomfortable transition of roles between parent and child. "I need you to see me as capable," I told Daniel, "not fragile." "I do," he said, "but sometimes I forget." "And I need to feel welcome," Melissa admitted, "not like I'm trespassing in a shrine." That word again, shrine, museum, past. "This house holds memories," I said, "but it is not a graveyard. It is still living." We agreed on something small to begin with. The wiring would be updated, the lighting could be improved, brighter bulbs perhaps, a new fixture if I approved it. The cabinets would be restored, not replaced, and any future changes would require a conversation first, not assumption, conversation. When they left that night, the house felt different, not because the walls had changed, but because something invisible had shifted. I walked through each room slowly before bed. I touched the staircase railing Thomas had sanded smooth. I adjusted a slightly crooked picture frame of Daniel at age 5. I stood in the doorway of the kitchen and imagined it whole again. This house had survived storms, financial struggles, illness, loss. It could survive this too. But I knew something else now. Preserving the past doesn't mean freezing time. It means carrying it forward with respect. And perhaps, just perhaps, I was finally ready to learn that balance.
The following week felt like living inside a house mid-sentence. Half-finished thoughts, exposed corners, promises of restoration hovering in the air. The contractor returned, this time under my direction. That distinction mattered more than I expected. When he knocked, he looked at me, not past me. He asked for my approval before moving a single board. I signed the updated work order myself. It wasn't about control, it was about acknowledgement. Daniel came by every evening after work. At first, I suspected it was out of guilt, but by the third day, I realized something had shifted in him, too. He stayed longer than necessary. Sometimes he brought takeout. Sometimes he just sat at the table, elbows resting on the wood, watching the progress. Melissa joined occasionally, quieter than usual. She no longer carried a clipboard. She carried questions. "Would you prefer warm lighting or neutral?" she asked one afternoon, holding up 2 sample bulbs. "Warm," I answered without hesitation. "This kitchen has always glowed in the evenings." She nodded thoughtfully. "That makes sense. That makes sense." 3 simple words, but they felt like an olive branch. The cabinets were carefully reinstalled, each piece lifted as though it were fragile china. I stood nearby while the contractor adjusted the hinges. When the final screw tightened, I ran my hand along the wood grain. There were faint scratches from removal, but they were minor. Scars, perhaps, proof of what had almost been lost. Daniel watched me quietly. "They look good," he said. "They look like home," I replied. He swallowed. Over the next few days, we addressed the wiring behind the walls. The contractor showed me frayed insulation that could have sparked a fire. I had never known. The realization unsettled me, not because I had been wrong, but because I had been unaware. Thomas had always handled the hidden things, the parts of the house that no one saw but kept everything running. Without him, I had focused on surfaces, on preservation. Perhaps I had neglected some deeper maintenance. That thought humbled me. One evening, while the contractor worked in the hallway, Daniel and I sat on the porch swing. The maple tree Thomas planted decades ago had grown tall and steady, its branches stretching protectively over the yard. "Do you ever feel," Daniel began slowly, "like you're stuck between being someone's child and being someone's adult?" I smiled faintly. "Every day." He laughed softly. "When Dad died, I felt like I had to step up, protect you." "I know," I said.
but I didn't know how, and I think sometimes I still don't. I studied his face in the fading light. He wasn't the little boy running through sprinklers anymore. He was a man carrying responsibilities I could only partially see. "You protect me by respecting me, not by managing me," I said gently. He nodded slowly. "I was afraid," he continued, "afraid that if something happened to you here alone, I'd regret not doing more." "And I was afraid," I replied, "that if you changed too much, I'd lose what little of your father still feels tangible." We sat in that shared honesty for a long moment. Grief has a way of hiding inside decisions that look practical. A few days later, Melissa asked if she could come over alone. Her request surprised me. When she arrived, she didn't bring design samples or renovation plans. She brought a photo album. "I found this while helping Daniel clean the garage," she said softly. "I think it's yours." I opened it carefully. Inside were photographs from the early years of the house: Thomas on a ladder painting the siding, Daniel in overalls holding a tiny hammer, me standing on the porch laughing at something long forgotten. Melissa sat beside me quietly as I turned the pages. "He looks kind," she said, pointing to a picture of Thomas kneeling in the garden. I said he was. She hesitated. I think I've been competing with a ghost." Her honesty startled me. "I walk in here and feel like I'm compared to a standard I can't meet, a love story that's already perfect." I closed the album gently. "You're not meant to replace him. You're meant to build your own story with Daniel." She blinked rapidly, holding back tears. "I never wanted to disrespect what you had." "I know that now," I said. We sat in silence, the kind that doesn't strain. "I'd like to help you update a few things," she said carefully, "not change them, just preserve them safely." I considered her words. "Would you help me go through Thomas's study?" I asked. Her eyes widened slightly. "Are you sure?" "Yes." That room had remained almost untouched for 9 years. Papers stacked exactly where he left them, tools in the same drawer. I had avoided sorting through it fully, afraid that moving anything would feel like erasing him. But perhaps preservation didn't mean freezing dust in place. Together, we spent the afternoon organizing. We scanned important documents. We placed fragile items in protective sleeves. We kept what mattered. We let go of what didn't. When I handed her one of Thomas's old fountain pens, she held it reverently. "He would have liked you," I said without thinking. Her eyes filled. "I hope so." As the weeks passed, the house regained its shape. Fresh paint replaced the stripped wallpaper, soft cream chosen together. The lighting warmed the kitchen in the evenings. The wiring was secure. The cabinet stood proudly once more. It wasn't identical to before, but it wasn't erased either. One Sunday afternoon, Daniel and Melissa came over for dinner. I cooked Thomas's favorite pot roast. We sat at the restored table, sunlight filtering through clean curtains. Melissa looked around thoughtfully. "It feels balanced," she said. "Yes," I agreed, "it does." Daniel reached for my hand across the table. "Thank you for not shutting us out." "Thank you for learning to knock," I replied gently. We laughed softly. That night, after they left, I walked through each room again, not inspecting, appreciating. The house had changed, but it still felt like mine, and I realized something important. The threat hadn't been the paint or the cabinets. The threat had been silence. When we don't speak our fears, they turn into bulldozers. When we don't set boundaries, love becomes assumption. I stood in the kitchen and turned on the warm lights. The room glowed softly, wrapping around me like an old sweater that had been mended, not replaced. This house was still full of memory, but now it was also full of understanding. And perhaps that was the most important renovation of all. A month after the renovation pause, though it no longer felt like a pause, but rather a careful reset, the house settled into its new rhythm. The cream-colored walls reflected the afternoon light in a way that felt softer than the old wallpaper ever had. The wiring was updated, the cabinets stood proudly restored, and the new light fixture above the kitchen table cast a warm, gentle glow each evening. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't modern in the way Melissa once imagined, it was simply steady. and steady felt right. But something inside me had shifted too. For years after Thomas died, I had clung to the house as if it were the only solid ground beneath my feet. I treated every object like a sacred relic. Every scratch was untouchable. Every change felt like betrayal. I told myself I was honoring his memory, but perhaps I was also hiding inside it. One quiet Tuesday afternoon, I found myself standing in front of the hallway closet, the one I hadn't opened fully in nearly a decade. Inside were boxes labeled in Thomas's handwriting, winter coats he no longer wore, old financial records, a toolbox he insisted on keeping just in case. I reached for the first box and carried it into the living room. I didn't call Daniel. I didn't call Melissa. This was something I needed to do alone. As I opened the lid, the faint scent of sawdust and aftershave drifted up. My hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of memory. Inside were old blueprints of minor renovations Thomas once dreamed of doing, expanding the porch, adding a skylight in the hallway. I smiled softly. He had wanted to change things too. He had never intended for the house to remain frozen in time. He just believed in thoughtful change. That realization settled deep in my chest. I spent hours sorting through papers, deciding what to keep and what to release. Some documents were no longer necessary. Some tools had rusted beyond repair. I created 3 piles: preserve, donate, discard. Each decision felt like a quiet conversation with the past. That evening, Daniel stopped by unexpectedly. He paused in the doorway, surprised to see the organized stacks. "Wow," he said gently, "you're cleaning." I laughed softly. "I suppose I am." He stepped inside, looking around carefully. "You okay?" "Yes," I said, and meant it. I realized something. He waited. "Your father wasn't afraid of change. He just believed it should be respectful." Daniel nodded slowly. "He always talked things through." "Yes, he did." We sat together on the couch, surrounded by pieces of the past laid bare. "I'm proud of you, Mom," he said suddenly. The words startled me. "For what?" "For standing your ground, and for listening, too." I studied his face. There was no defensiveness now, no tension, just sincerity. "I'm proud of you," I replied, "for admitting when you were wrong." He smiled faintly. "Melissa's been different too. I've noticed." She told me she felt like she was trying to earn her place here instead of just living in it. "That's a heavy burden to carry," I said softly. He hesitated. "We've been talking about starting a family." The words hung in the air, delicate and life-altering. "A baby?" I whispered. He nodded, a mixture of excitement and nervousness flickering across his face. My heart swelled and tightened at the same time. "I want my child to know this house, but I also want it to feel safe, updated where it needs to be." There it was again, not control, not ownership, protection. I reached for his hand. "Then we'll make it safe, together. Not as a takeover, not as an erasure, as a collaboration." Over the following weeks, Melissa joined me in small projects that felt entirely different from that first unauthorized demolition. We installed handrails in the basement. We replaced a worn step on the back porch. We reorganized the pantry to make it more accessible. Each task began with conversation. "Would this be all right with you?" she would ask, and I would answer honestly. Sometimes yes, sometimes no, and each time my voice carried weight. One afternoon, while sorting through old photo frames in the hallway, Melissa paused at a large family portrait from Daniel's high school graduation. She studied it quietly. "I used to think these made the house feel crowded, but now they feel grounding." I smiled. "They tell a story," I said. She nodded. "Maybe we could add one of us, too." The suggestion wasn't invasive. It wasn't about replacing. It was about adding. "I'd like that," I replied. A few days later, we framed a wedding photo of her and Daniel and placed it at the end of the hallway, not covering anything, not displacing a single memory, just expanding the timeline. When I stepped back and looked at the wall, something inside me softened. The house wasn't losing its history, it was gaining chapters. One evening, as I prepared dinner, Melissa lingered in the kitchen after Daniel stepped outside to take a phone call. "She owe you something," she said quietly. I turned to face her. "I never asked what this house meant to you. I only saw what I thought it lacked." Her eyes were steady, no defensiveness left. "I meant love," I said simply. "Security, growth. It's where I became a wife, where I became a mother, where I learned how to be alone." She swallowed. "I think I was afraid I'd never measure up to that." "You don't need to measure up," I replied gently. "You just need to show up." Tears shimmered briefly in her eyes. "I want to show up," she said, and I believed her. Later that night, after they left, I stood once more in the kitchen under the warm light. I thought about the day I came home from Charleston, the shock, the anger, the feeling of being erased. That pain was real, but so was this growth. Sometimes betrayal isn't the end of a relationship. Sometimes it's the alarm bell that forces everyone to wake up. I had learned to speak instead of swallow my discomfort. Daniel had learned to ask instead of assume. Melissa had learned to respect instead of redesign. The house stood around me steady, altered, alive. And for the first time in years, I no longer felt like I was guarding it alone. I was living in it again. It was late October when Melissa called me on a Thursday afternoon, her voice trembling in a way I had never heard before. For a brief second, my heart leapt into my throat, fear arriving before reason. "Lorraine," she whispered, "are you home?" I told her I was, and she asked if she could come over. Alone. The way she said it made something inside me brace itself. When she arrived, she looked pale but radiant in a way I couldn't immediately place. She stood in my kitchen, the same kitchen that had nearly divided us months earlier, and held both of my hands in hers. "I'm pregnant," she said softly. The word seemed to float in the air before settling into my chest. Pregnant. A new life. A continuation. I felt my knees weaken slightly and gripped the edge of the counter for balance. She started to apologize for surprising me, but I pulled her into an embrace before she could finish. I hadn't realized how deeply I had longed to hear those words. A grandchild, a child who might crawl across these same floors, tug open these same cabinet doors, look up at the maple tree through the front window, just as Daniel once had. Tears filled my eyes, not from sadness this time, but from something tender and full. "Does Daniel know?" I asked, still holding her shoulders. She nodded. "He's at work. He wanted me to tell you first." That small gesture, choosing me, meant more than she could have known. We sat at the table, hands wrapped around mugs of tea neither of us drank. She spoke about doctor appointments, about morning sickness, about fear and excitement mixing together in ways she couldn't quite separate. As she talked, I saw not the woman who once tried to redesign my life, but a young mother-to-be navigating the unknown. And suddenly, I remembered being her age, sitting in this very kitchen, telling Thomas we were expecting Daniel. The same tremor in my voice, the same combination of joy and terror. "You'll be a wonderful mother," I said gently. She blinked, surprised. "You think so?" "Yes," I answered without hesitation, "because you care, and because you're willing to admit when you're afraid." She laughed softly, wiping at her eyes. "I'm terrified." "Good," I replied. "That means you understand the responsibility." Later that evening, Daniel arrived with flowers and a grin that could have powered the entire neighborhood. He wrapped his arms around me and lifted me slightly off the floor like he used to when he was a teenager trying to show off his strength. "You're going to be a grandma," he he whispered, and for the first time since Thomas died, I felt the house expand, not physically, but emotionally. It was as if every wall leaned outward to make space for what was coming. Over the following weeks, conversations shifted, not about demolition or inheritance, about cribs, about safety gates, about whether the spare bedroom could eventually hold a rocking chair. I surprised myself by suggesting it. If you'd like, I told them one Sunday afternoon, we could set up a small nursery corner here, just in case you need rest during visits. Daniel's eyes softened. Melissa squeezed my hand. "Are you sure?" she asked carefully. I looked around the room, the balanced paint, the restored cabinets, the layered photographs on the walls. "This house was built for family," I said. "It would be a shame not to let it continue serving that purpose." Preparing that corner felt different from the earlier renovation conflict. This wasn't about replacing the past. It was about welcoming the future. We chose a soft, neutral color for the small alcove near the guest room window. I kept Thomas's old rocking chair, but had it reupholstered for comfort. Melissa insisted on paying for the fabric. We laughed over sample swatches spread across the same table that had once been threatened by quartz countertops. And each time we made a decision, it was together. One evening, as we assembled a small bookshelf for children's stories, Daniel paused and looked around thoughtfully. "I'm glad we didn't tear down that wall," he admitted quietly. "Me too," I said. "Open spaces are overrated," he added with a faint smile. "Sometimes," I replied, "separate rooms give love room to breathe." Melissa rested a hand on her growing belly and smiled. "I think this baby's lucky to have so much history waiting." History. The word no longer felt like an anchor. It felt like a foundation. As winter approached, I found myself thinking about Thomas more often, but not with the sharp ache of loss. Instead, with a quiet sense of continuity. I imagined him standing in the doorway, hands in his pockets, watching us prepare. He would have teased Daniel about diapers. He would have insisted on checking every crib screw twice. He would have been proud. On the first evening we lit the fireplace that season, the three of us sat in the living room, warm light flickering against the cream walls. The house felt full, not cluttered, not heavy, just full. Melissa leaned back against the couch and said something that settled deeply into my heart. "I used to think this house was stuck in the past. Now I see it's layered, like a story still being written." I reached over and squeezed her hand. "That's exactly what it is." That night, after they left, I walked slowly down the hallway, pausing in front of the photographs. Thomas holding baby Daniel, Daniel in his graduation cap, Daniel and Melissa on their wedding day. And soon another frame would join them, not replacing, adding. I stood in the nursery corner and gently rocked Thomas's old chair. The wood creaked softly, familiar and steady. I realized then that the greatest fear I had felt when I walked into that partially demolished kitchen months ago wasn't about cabinets or paint. It was about disappearing, about becoming irrelevant in my own home. But relevance isn't maintained by freezing time. It's maintained by participating in it, by speaking, by listening, by allowing others to grow without surrendering yourself. The house had taught me that. And perhaps in some quiet way, I had taught it too. I turned off the lights one by one and stood for a moment in the soft darkness. This home had weathered misunderstanding, it had survived assumption, and now it was preparing for laughter again, the high, bright kind that only children bring. I placed my hand over my heart and whispered into the stillness, "We're ready." The winter the baby was born was the coldest we had seen in years. Snow settled thick and quiet along Maple Drive, frosting the branches of the old tree Thomas planted and softening the edges of every rooftop. It felt as though the world had wrapped itself in a blanket, waiting. Melissa went into labor just after midnight on a Tuesday. Daniel's voice shook when he called me. "Mom," he said, breathless and frightened and thrilled all at once, "it's time." I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the small overnight bag I had quietly prepared weeks earlier and drove carefully through the snow-dusted streets, whispering prayers the entire way. The hospital lights glowed against the dark sky, and when I walked into that maternity ward, I was carried back decades to the night I delivered Daniel. The same sterile scent, the same hum of machines, the same fragile line between fear and miracle. Hours later, as dawn stretched pale light across the horizon, I held my granddaughter for the first time. They named her Clara May. Clara after Melissa's grandmother, May after my mother. A merging of histories, a blending of stories. When the nurse placed her in my arms, she was impossibly small, wrapped in a soft pink blanket, her tiny fingers curling instinctively around mine. I felt something inside me unlock, a door I hadn't even realized was closed. Love poured through it, fierce and immediate. I whispered her name and promised her, silently, that she would always know where she came from. Bringing Clara home weeks later felt like ushering spring into the middle of winter. The house seemed to wake up the moment Daniel carried her through the front door. Even the maple tree outside looked somehow prouder, its branches steady against the cold wind. Melissa moved carefully, exhausted but glowing. I watched her settle into the rocking chair in the nursery corner, cradling Clara beneath the soft light we had chosen together. The chair creaked gently, the same familiar sound that once rocked Daniel to sleep. Time felt circular instead of linear. In those first weeks, I stayed close but mindful. I cooked meals, I folded tiny onesies, I held Clara when Melissa needed rest, but I knocked before entering rooms. I asked before offering advice. The lesson of that renovation had etched itself deeply into me. Love thrives on respect, not assumption. One evening, as I stood at the stove warming soup, I overheard Daniel whispering to his daughter, "This is Daddy's house too, you know, Grandma's house, a house full of stories." His voice carried pride, not ownership, and I realized that something fundamental had healed between us. Melissa approached me later that night, Clara asleep against her shoulder. "I was thinking," she said softly, "maybe we could hang one more photo in the hallway, a generational one. You, me, Clara." I smiled. "I'd like that very much." When we placed the frame beside the others days later, I stepped back and studied the wall. Thomas holding baby Daniel, Daniel and Melissa on their wedding day, and now me holding Clara. The wall hadn't lost anything, it had simply grown. As weeks turned into months, the house found its new rhythm. Clara's cries echoed down the hallway at dawn. Her laughter filled the kitchen by afternoon. The updated wiring hummed safely behind the walls, unseen but essential. The restored cabinets opened and closed dozens of times a day, storing baby bottles beside old teacups. The house no longer felt like a battleground of past and future. It felt like a bridge. One afternoon, while Clara napped, Melissa and I sat together at the table. Snow melted slowly outside, dripping from the eaves. "I've been thinking about that day," she said quietly, "when you came home from vacation." I met her eyes. "So have I." She swallowed. "I'm grateful you didn't shut us out." I considered that. There had been a moment when I nearly did, a moment when anger threatened to harden into distance. "I'm grateful you stayed," I replied, "even when it was uncomfortable." She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. There were no design plans between us now, only shared responsibility and shared love. Later that evening, Daniel lingered on the porch with me while Clara slept inside. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney. "Mom," he said thoughtfully, I didn't realize how afraid I was of losing you until that renovation fight. I looked at him gently. Fear makes us do foolish things. He nodded. But you taught me something important. What's that? I asked. That protecting someone doesn't mean taking over their life. His words settled warmly in my chest. That lesson had been costly, but worth it. Spring arrived slowly, melting the snow and coaxing green from the maple tree's branches. One bright morning, I stood at the kitchen sink, watching Clara in the backyard, bundled in a tiny jacket, Daniel holding her securely as he showed her the first buds of the season. Melissa laughed beside them. The scene felt familiar and brand new all at once. I could almost see Thomas there, kneeling in the grass decades earlier with a toddler Daniel pointing to the same tree. The continuity was almost overwhelming. The house was no longer just a container for memory. It was an active participant in our lives. Its walls held laughter again. Its floors felt the patter of small socks. Its rooms carried conversation instead of tension. And I understood something I hadn't fully grasped before. Preservation and growth are not enemies, they're partners. A home does not honor the past by resisting all change. It honors it by carrying forward what matters and releasing what does not. One evening, after Daniel and Melissa packed up Clara to head home, I remained alone in the quiet house. But it was no longer the heavy quiet I once feared. It was peaceful. I walked through each room slowly, touching familiar surfaces. The cream walls glowed warmly. The cabinets stood steady. The hallway displayed our layered history like chapters in a book still being written. I paused in front of Thomas's photograph and smiled. "We did all right," I whispered. I realized then that the true renovation had never been about paint or cabinets. It had been about relationships, about redefining roles without erasing identity, about learning that boundaries are not barriers to love, they are its foundation. When I returned from vacation months ago and found my home dismantled, I thought I was losing everything. In truth, I was being forced into a conversation we should have had long before. Sometimes life tears down a wall not to destroy you, but to reveal where the structure needs strengthening. That shock, that hurt, that fierce defense of my space, it led us here, to a house that feels both rooted and alive, to a son who understands respect, to a daughter-in-law who understands belonging, to a granddaughter who will grow up knowing her story is woven from many threads, none of them discarded. I turned off the kitchen light and let the soft evening settle around me. The maple tree swayed gently outside, steady as ever. This house, once nearly changed without my permission, now stood as proof that love, when guided by honesty and respect, can rebuild anything. And as I climbed the stairs to bed, I carried with me a simple, steady truth. No one can remodel your life without your consent, but when you invite others in with clarity and courage, they can help you strengthen its foundation.